Welcome to the Better Podcast, where you and I get better in this game called life. I'm Chin, your co-host today, and I co-founded The Smart Investor, an investment site where we talk about stocks all day.
And I'm your co-host Ser Jing. I run the Good Investors investment blog and a global equities investment fund together with my friend Jeremy Chia. Now, before we start, here's a disclaimer. Nothing on this show should be taken as investment advice. It is purely for informational and entertainment purposes only. All opinions expressed in this show by us and our guests are solely our own opinions. We and our guests may hold positions in the financial assets discussed in the show, and these holdings are subject to change at any time.
So, good evening, everyone. It's Friday, 8th of July, and we're back with episode number 9 of the Better Podcast. And today with me again is Ser Jing and myself, I'm Chen. And as usual, we have no idea what we're going to talk about. So let's get started with something which I just read recently, right? So this is with regards to the founding of Visa. And I'm going to give some context, which may take a while, but then ultimately I want to talk about how the idea of Visa actually came about. So just to set the stage, I think back then when Visa was not available yet, there were a few problems with personal banks extending personal loans. These loans tend to be very specific to the merchant, where you would have to turn up at the bank to actually apply for a loan to actually to do whatever you want to do. So this is specific for what you want to do, right? And that's very restrictive, and it's also very troublesome because you will need to turn up at the bank to actually make that application itself. Now, on the other end, if you want to lend any money, it was available, but it's also at the merchant itself only, right? So I know that when I was young, my mom would go to the grocery store, and this was before ATMs, right? It wasn't so easy to just take out money from anytime you want. She would go to the grocery store, she'll pick up a few things, and then there's little tiny book called a 555 notebook, if you know it. Then the grocer will write down everything in the book, and then at the end of the month, she will pay whatever is owed in that book, right? So there is lending, but that lending only happens in one specific merchant, right? So whenever you lend from that one specific merchant. Now, there was one innovation at that point of time, which was the Diners Club card. Now, the Diners Club card was interesting because it allowed you to use a single source of cash to spend at multiple merchants. So it was an innovation in that way. Your sort of spending is not limited to one merchant, but you could spend it in a few locations, right? So that was how the idea or innovation of Visa came out. There was a guy named Joe Williams. He was from Bank of America, and he came up with this idea called the Bank of America card or Bank American card. Bank Americard, sorry. So the idea was quite I think naive and probably reckless in a sense, but it also did something very unique because I think that as a business we often treasure something called a network effect, but very often we don't talk about how that network effect actually comes about. Was it the merchants who come in first, or were the buyers who come in first, right? Because you need both, right? When you have more merchants, more buyers will be interested to sign up for your card because there's more places you can spend it in. And if you're a merchant, you would want one with many customers because then there's a possibility of you closing a sale, right? But how do you get this network effect started? So what Joe Williams did was he did something I think which was pretty reckless. Bank of America back then was in Fresno, and they had Fresno was a town of maybe 250,000 people, and he just mailed out this card to like 600,000 people, right? So sorry, to 60,000 people, right? So 60,000 out of 250, and just literally put money in their hands, right? $300 to $500, and he said that you could use it for whatever merchants you want, and you would only have to pay a 6% interest rate, right? And of course, it just grew like wildfire because you're placing all these cards on with people. It's free money, so to speak. And then it was easier for the bank then to turn around now that you have 60,000 people willing to spend this and just sign up merchants as fast as they could, right? And this is sort of how the network effect started building. Now, of course, it was a terrible idea because you don't just put money in people's hand and expect them to pay on time and so on. So the default rate was actually north of 20%, and obviously that 6% is not going to make up for the losses. So the interesting thing though is that the Bank of America actually persisted with that idea because they hit upon something which would solve two things. They would be able to have a way to provide consumer loans that are accepted in many different merchants, and it will also cut out the process of people needing to turn up to the bank just for every single thing which they need to buy, right? So it was a way to really revolutionize and make this more accessible, so to speak. Now, the part which I was really interested in is when 2000, I think 1966 came about, right? So the first card came out in 1958. So this was roughly about 8 years later. By then, the idea had caught on and people were starting to notice, right? There were at least more than millions of cards were available. There were hundreds of thousands of merchants, tens of thousands of merchants, and people could see that this was going to be a hot idea, right? So a lot of banks wanted in on this idea, and what was interesting at that point of time was in 1966 a competitive card emerged, which is the predecessor for MasterCard, and 5 banks actually got together to come out with something called a Master Charge card, right? Now, faced with this pressure, Visa decided to license out their Bank America card, or at that time it's called the Bank America card. The Bank of America decided to license it out to more banks, but very quickly they ran into a lot of problems, right? Because the key here is the banks themselves are competing with each other. They are exchanging sharp elbows. They are the ones flooding the market, just issuing cards like crazy. They're sending it to their pets and people and so on, and they're just trying to basically flood the market with all these cards. I know I've been talking for a while, so I'm going to pause here if you have any questions or statements to make.
No, I don't have any questions, but I think I'm just guessing here that you might be going along the angle of how Visa or Bank America managed to flourish after Bank America removed its brand name.
Yep.
Okay,
Yes.
I shall let you carry on then, because I have a comment to make on that, but I'll let you go first.
Yeah. So I think what was special was in 1968, right, where so imagine that they have this hot idea, and then there's this competitive network which came out. They decided to license out their card, which then is adopted by multiple banks. But they soon ran into a lot of problems because it was very hard to get all the different banks to cooperate with each other, right? Because you have a great idea, but they are in effect competitors, because when you issue the card to people, of course that bank earns their money by lending out money and earning that interest. So they would want the customer to be using their card and not some other bank's card, right? So how do you get so many people who are competing and yet cooperate with each other? And that was where an individual by the name of D.W. Hawk, who actually sounds Chinese, but he's not. And he came out with a radical idea, and where all these banks would be allowed to do their own thing, and yet when it comes to very specific activities, they would actually cooperate very closely with one another. And there's a wonderful article on Fast Company which walks through this entire details, which I'll post on the show notes. So what happens is that at that point of time, organizations were very much top down. So everything is controlled very much like an army, where you you would have a general at the top and deciding what you do or for every facet of the business, right? And D Hawk was this guy who felt that this organization or this form of organization will not succeed in the long term because he felt it was too restrictive and it will not be able to adapt to changes along the way. So he had this radical idea of somehow matching chaos of going to different markets and yet have order. And he came out with this term called cathodic, right? Which is not exactly a combination of words of chaos and order, but there you go. So his whole idea was that to get all these banks to sort of cooperate with each other, he would allow them to do whatever they want in marketing their products. He would not impose any restrictions there, but then he would define very specific activities where the banks would have to cooperate really, really deeply, right? So there'll be things like the card, the layout of the card has to be the same, right? And then you will have making sure that the merchants are being paid on time, right? Because there'll be exchange of cash between the banks, and making sure that the consumer is able to access all this debt and so on. So there are very specific activities for the sole purpose of maintaining this network that were imposed on them. And these restrictions, going back to last week's podcast, where you're imposing
That's what I thought.
very specific constraints, which are only specific to sustain the network. And then the rest of it, anybody can really do whatever they want. How they market the card, what they did with that card, it's a free open play. But how you actually cooperate and make sure that the network, which is good for everyone, is sustained, is to have very specific activities defined and corporate. And that, I think, in essence, was how Visa was able to convince and get everyone on the table. And the other part which was not explored is how D Hawk actually managed to convince Bank of America to let go of fees of the entire idea and have it more as a non-profit. Because if you look at the value of Visa today, right, it's more than I think 420 billion, and Bank of America is worth 260 billion, if I'm not wrong. So you can see that it was, I think, quite a unique story. A person who came in at a certain point of time who was willing to think differently. And I think the final point I wanted to make was that he believed that organizations shouldn't be too structured, where they are able to have the ability to adapt to different conditions, because in every country there's different policies, there are different ways people spend money, and to restrict or to dictate how all this is done will be, I think, devastating for a company which needs to expand, globally the way Visa did. So that's the end of my long monologue, and I'll keep quiet for Ser Jing's thoughts.
No, thanks for sharing. It's actually the first time I'm hearing such a detailed history of how Visa came about. The part that caught my attention really is about when Bank of America gave up the network to allow other banks to kind of participate. I think there is a potential example today that could happen, I think, in the form of Amazon and Amazon Web Services.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there have been, I've seen articles that describe how some of Amazon's retail-oriented competitors refuse to use Amazon Web Services because it's owned by the parent company.
Mm-hmm.
So there could be a case of, an independent AWS and an independent Amazon retail being worth more combined, as opposed to them being as one separate company. So I think, looking at the history of Visa, there could perhaps be an argument to be made for the separation of Amazon's cloud computing and retail businesses. So that's the thought that I had that jumped out at me actually when I was listening to what you said. Do you have any comments on that? If not, I have another thought actually that popped up when you were talking about Visa.
Not so much. I think when it comes to decentralization, I think the main one I can think of is Berkshire Hathaway, where I think they probably only have like 25 employees in the corporate office, and everything else is just decentralized. And we spoke, I think, about this when we were talking about Brooks running shoes.
Yeah, I
Your
think
next
so.
thought.
Yeah, my next thought. So it's actually related to a podcast that on the Colossus family of
Mhm.
podcasts that featured Kenneth Stanley, who's a professor in computer science.
Mhm.
So it's so I wouldn't go into details about what the whole podcast is. I will provide a link in the show notes. But what is, I think, somewhat related to what you mentioned about Visa, the whole idea of decentralization, is Stanley's idea about how innovation can actually uh, will be able to take place at a greater degree if people are allowed more freedom to explore, right? And his idea is that often when people talk about collaboration, we think about having a whole bunch of people sitting together in one room and hashing out ideas. That's how, or at least that's how people generally think about collaboration. But he gave this really interesting angle to collaboration in the sense that if somebody takes a, say for example, if somebody uses the discovery of electricity, right, to build a product that uses electricity to provide convenience to consumers, that is also a form of collaboration, because you are in effect taking somebody else's work and building upon it. So you are in effect collaborating with everyone else who had a hand to play in terms of discovering electricity, right? But the idea is that you would also, an important ingredient in that would be to not allow, or rather to remove, any form of permission seeking, right? Meaning that if an individual within the organization sees something really interesting, or a really interesting development happening within the organization, he or she should be allowed to jump on that and continue to build, rather than to seek approval from committees. Because what's interesting here is that, or at least according to Stanley, what's interesting is that there are every individual, because of his or her own unique life experiences and unique knowledge base, can sometimes see things that other people cannot see. And if an organization were to make decisions on innovation via committee, meaning that where everybody sits down together to hash out a yes or no answer, then that often will not work as well as if an individual is allowed within a certain constrained space. You give that person a big constrained space and allow the person to be able to jump in and work on anything interesting that he or she sees. So that's how he thinks about innovation, which is I think, okay, it's not exactly related to your Visa example, but when you mentioned the word decentralization, that was what popped up in my mind.
See, let me just read this paragraph because I think it's really good. From the Fast Company article, right, which I think captures the real essence. It says to reconcile that tension, and this tension he's talking about is the competitive nature of these banks trying to flood the market with their competitive credit cards, right? He said Hawke and his colleagues employed a combination of Lao Tzu, Adam Smith, and Thomas Jefferson. So, and for example, instead of trying to enforce cooperation by restricting what members can do, the Visa bylaws, would love to see what those bylaws are, encourage them to compete and innovate as much as possible, right? So he said that members are free to create, price, market, and service their own products under the Visa name. And at the same time, a narrow band of activity essential to the success of the whole, meaning only essential to maintaining the network, they engage in the most intense cooperation, right? So this harmonious blend of cooperation and competition is what allowed the system to expand worldwide in the face of different currencies, languages, legal codes, customs, cultures, and political philosophies.
No, that's a really good paragraph. I need to read the article once you're done recording this. But yeah, like you said earlier, I think this really gels nicely with what we talked about last week in terms of constraints being deconstraining. Right? I think it's another really good example of how when an entity imposes a certain level of small constraints, it allows some wonderful things to flourish on top of it. And yeah, I think Visa and of course Mastercard, I think is another great example of this. I remember last week I was saying that I was putting a bookmark on the idea of business models where constraints can be constrained. Yeah, you beat me to it because you came up with this Visa conversation and we're on it now. But yeah, I don't have a good example yet. I'm still thinking about it.
Yeah. I couldn't resist, but there's another paragraph I think is pretty good. So
Yeah, go
no
on.
one way of doing business dictated from headquarters could have possibly worked. And it's referring to the complexity of business across the world, right? It was beyond the power of reason to design an organization to deal with such complexity, says Hawke, and beyond the reach of imagination to perceive all the conditions that it would encounter. And so his counter proposal would be that an organization had to be based on biological concepts to evolve, in effect, invent and organize itself. It's unique, right? I never knew that about Visa.
Yeah, I think B Hawk is a man who was way ahead of his time.
And I think it's quite remarkable that I would consider quite a contrarian idea that he managed to get people to agree to it. I would have loved to see him in action in that meeting room, trying to convince all these banks to buy into his idea. So I think I'll stop here because I've been speaking and just hand the mic over to Ser Jing.
Yep. So what I would like to talk about is actually this idea that which can be summarized as markets grow, the individual units within that market gets granularized and new business models can emerge. So I got this idea from another podcast, a recent podcast from Colossus, which featured Martin Casado. And so what he said, which was an example that I was fascinated with. And so he said that in 1913, Ford Motors, the car manufacturer in the US, had a factory called the Rogue River Factory. And this factory was basically taking in all kinds of raw materials, right? You could like water, rubber, coal, metals, all into that factory and building a car, right?
Mhm.
But today, when you actually build a car, and I think you probably have, you probably know better since in one of our previous lives you were you were in the auto industry.
Yep.
And when you build cars, you actually have very specific suppliers for each individual part that goes into a car, right? Like you want a certain screw or certain bolt or a certain piece of rubber or a certain piece of plastic. There are specific suppliers for that. And the reason why this happened now and not in 1913 was because back then the entire automobile industry was still tiny. So the market for automobiles could not be granularized. Yeah, so that's the tongue
I have a little story to share because I do remember the founding of the Michelin Guide. Michelin, of course, is actually a provider of tires, and you'll be wondering why is a tire provider coming out with a dining and cuisine menu ranking system, right? So the story went that when people had cars, they wanted to give people reasons to go out, and dining was one of them. So they decided to come out with this book with all these dining options, the best places to eat which you can come, and that's how the Michelin Guide came about.
Yep. So then maybe back to my idea. Actually back to what I was discussing. So today you can actually have like all these very specific suppliers to the automobile industry because it's just become so big. And so I'm just part of me would love to go into the future actually to see what new types of businesses will pop up in the digital economy as it becomes larger and larger, as computing or cloud computing and all kinds of digital infrastructure businesses become larger and larger. What could become granularized and what new types of businesses could emerge?
Yeah, I think that firstly, that this sum of I call it vertical integration, meaning that if you look at Tesla itself, they manufacture a lot of the things which they need for the car by themselves. I think they outsource some of it, but not the majority of it, including the stamping of the body itself for the car, is all done in house. And I suppose that is important for them because they are coming up with something completely new. I think they were the first car company to be started in like a really long time, and still be successful, right? So it's a unique. There were not a lot of people attempting to create car companies because the investment and capital expenditures are really high, right? And that I think also probably forced this the consolidation and so on. There are I've been to Malaysia where there are machines which are so big, and but the country population, even at 32 million, is not going to be able to support the kind of car volume which would justify the investment of such a machine. There's this huge machine called a DISA machine, which is used for um, iron casting and so on. It's probably as big as 2 or 3 HDB blocks. Not HDB blocks, HDB units. Blocks would be extreme. But you're talking about machines that big, and you really need the volume to be able to justify investment in such a huge machine, right? And I think going back to and the other example I had in my mind was when I was in Vietnam. There was also the way that Japanese suppliers actually or Japanese companies actually set up base in Vietnam. At the point of time, Vietnam did not have an auto industry, right? So there were a lot of sort of secondary supporting industries which they need, which were not available there. So what they had to do is to really bring their entire supply chain down to Vietnam, right? And they literally did that by setting up a plant and have their suppliers located within that plant itself. This is a plant owned by NIDAC. So if you are a well-performing stock, actually, if you want to look it up, they do micromotors and gauges, right? And they brought in like processes like some form of machining. There's a plating plant over there as well. Plating is always a problem. There was at my time when you're doing procurement in China, finding a plating supply is really difficult. But you need that volume to appear, and you need that industry to mature before all this sort of specialization starts to happen. When it comes to digital services, I think that I do see that there's verticalization which happening. So if you think about Google being generic search, you just go on Google and search for anything, right? But then there are arguably search which are more specific to certain industries. Think about Booking.com. That's in a way search for hotels, right? Think about Amazon. That's search for products, right? So there are these huge verticals where search as a very basic human need to search for something becomes very specific to a certain vertical. And I think that without getting too much into the weeds, I think SaaS, that will probably happen more often. There are a lot of horizontal SaaS companies such as Salesforce, where they provide a generic CRM tool for all industries, right? But when you go down to the and that may fit 10 or 20% of that industry, but if you want to go in like 50% or 60% to specific industries, then I think that you need a specific vertical SaaS company to provide and really customize for that specific requirement by the industry.
And I think the perfect example would be DIFA Systems, which
Correct.
started off by building CRM software for the life sciences industry.
Yeah, and there's another company called Encino, which does it for the banking sector. Which
does it do legal as well?
No, they don't do legal.
Just banking, right?
Yes. So if you I think interacted with the banks themselves, you'll find that a lot of banks are organized by product and not by customer, which is an eye-opening observation for me. But it's true, right? I once tried to transfer the debt which I had in one of my credit cards to another, or try to get it paid off using another form, right? And I couldn't do it because the two departments don't talk to each other, right? So, but and that is really an opportunity, right? For banks where nCino is able to come in, they become sort of that layer which binds everyone together, and so that instead of looking at whether that person is a credit card user or just an account user, you have this like complete view of that customer, that he's a credit card and so on and so forth, and all the services they have together, right? So I think software is the perfect tool for that.
And talking about the opportunity for digitalization in banking, right? I recently heard this really funny story. And true story as well. So I have a friend who's has close ties with people in Indonesia. So when he was back in the country recently, he met up with a couple of entrepreneurs, and one of them is actually in the insurance space. So he's trying to use technology to kind of improve the insurance industry in Indonesia. So they came out with all APIs and so on, with all the fancy looking insurance forms and all that for consumers. And they passed that over to the banks, and the banks and the insurance companies were like, can you send us paper copies instead, because we have no way to ingest your APIs.
Okay. Yeah.
So yeah, like sometimes I think when we think about like the potential for growth, I think in the digital economy, I think examples like this just drive home the point of how much more there is to run in that area.
Yeah, I think that there are still a lot of small problems to solve, and new problems will come up. And I think that the CEO of Shopify made a great point, because he was always of the opinion that in 2020, when the pandemic happened and this huge surge of people went online, he just felt that the software at that point of time was not up to mark. So imagine if you're using software from 10 years ago, right? And like you're using software from 2010, when I think that was the era of the iPhone 4, right? That tiny little iPhone with the, did they have the thumbprint yet? I'm not sure. I can't remember. But
just the home button.
Yeah, I remember Siri was out. But imagine if you're using software back then, there was probably no Zoom yet. How disappointed and how angry you would be, right? Knowing that today with Zoom, there's so much more you can do. And I think that as software becomes better, over time, there will be more and more use cases created.
Yep. I've always had this thought when COVID hit that we were lucky, the world was lucky that COVID happened in 2020 and not 2010 or 2000. Imagine back then when connectivity was in a relatively poorer state, much poorer state actually. It's just unsure if like the global economy could function as well as it did when the pandemic actually happened. So I think we
don't remember whether WhatsApp was popular back then, but there's so many things that I think we take for granted today, and I think there was a running joke where parents would tell their kids that, hey, I'm older than Google, which is true for me.
I think that's true for me too.
So with that, if there's nothing else, I think we can end the podcast.
Yeah, this is a good place to end. See you all next week.
Yeah, see you. Bye.